Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Walinga, and I'm a professor in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University here in Victoria, British Columbia. And welcome to our Sport Leadership and Social Change webinar series. The series has been running for well over, several years now, and it's fascinating to watch the discourse build and sustain itself and extend into other areas. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm so happy to be inviting a number of fantastic individuals who are doing very positive work in sport today. This is episode 28. There have probably been about 50 episodes by now, as I do many of these recorded sessions as well, which are like our bonus reel. And in episode 28, we're actually going to be looking at a series, 4 different episodes on building cultural integrity across the Canadian sports system, under the heading of the Culture Collaborative, the idea that we all are in this together to try to shift and enhance and strengthen the culture of sport across Canada. Part 1 will be talking to sport practitioners who've actually formed a community of practice, of which I'm part, that we've called the Culture Collaborative. And we're just trying to work on spreading the word of this idea that, culture really is at the heart of positive change within our sport organizations and within our sport system widely across our country and globally really as well. I mean, we're not the only country facing challenges that have to do with sport. I want to acknowledge and thank the Lekwungen and Quisepsin First Nations. They're also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt people because here in Victoria, of course, we have a long history of trying to indigenize and trying to learn Indigenous ways of being and knowing, because we are on unceded territories and there is a huge gap in our learning historically. Although we are not specifically responsible for inflicting harms on these people over the decades, we are responsible for acknowledging the truth of the past and doing better to reconcile our values with our behaviors and our actions and our practices. Right? If we truly value human beings and each individual, we really must do better going forward. I also want to highlight that the university where I operate and teach is on these lands, and we try our best to really acknowledge the learning that's available to us from the lands. It's staring us in the face. We're surrounded by 300 hectares of old growth forest, and it's constantly telling us and our students how important and how crucial diversity truly is to our development, our evolution, learning from one another. We also know, and we try to embody this in the programs that we offer, how important it is to in acknowledging our differences, to really mind the differences, but also then try to bridge through mediation, through conflict resolution, and through really just learning about one another, how important each of us is to the grand fabric of our universe, but also how important it is to really work out ways to interpersonally interact and connect. And so another area is communication and developing those channels and forums and practices that can foster that understanding, but also the sharing of knowledge, learning that allows the learning from one another. We also emphasize things like leadership and all the aspects of organizational development that value in organizations isn't just financial. Yes, that is one aspect of it, but we also must value the human beings that operate within it, the environment within which we're operating, and also, the relational value that's within organizations. So our programs try to address all of those aspects of interaction in society. We also partner with a number of different organizations, and we embody this principle of acknowledging that learning happens outside of the classroom as well. It's not just an academic endeavor. And so I'm very proud of a partnership that we have with a sport organization called Game Plan, which helps athletes transition out of sport and into other careers post competition. And that reflects the same principle of our flexible admission policy, which acknowledges that you've learned in your profession, whether you've learned through the work that you've done, the leadership that you've upheld, the practices that you've taken pursued. And so sport is like that too. We give credit for work experience, professional experience, and that counts in the sport realm as well. So I liaison with a number of athletes and helping them to articulate what it is that they've actually learned through their sport experience and how that can apply to various careers that they might want to pursue. We're always learning in whatever we do. I happen to be very involved in sport and I go backwards in this little boat every day and it teaches me something daily. But the reason this webinar is devoted to sport is it is one of those human endeavors like the arts, like theater, that has so much to teach and model for the world about how humans can operate within our environments in a productive and positive way. So sport at its best has so many truths and principles that it can share with the world. And that's our goal with this webinar series, to highlight those things. I'm part of this group called the Culture Collaborative. We are a community of practice that is trying to model that same principle, that as a team, we can offer insight, research, knowledge, we can support development in organizations and help them to build healthy, respectful, high-performing organizations through the principles of cultural integrity, that we bring into alignment the structures and practices and behaviors with the values that we uphold, so that when we have that true congruity, that alignment, of course, that provides such a strong foundation for everyone within the environment to build trust, to be able to then focus on their work and to be able to perform well. So that's culture in a nutshell. It takes work, right? It takes support, and that's what we're here to facilitate with the various resources we offer. So I'll be introducing you to a number of fantastic individuals today. We as a group are focusing on learning about, but also then sharing and exposing others to cultural leadership and governance, re-engineering, training, and support to help sport leaders better embody and comply with the demands of a modern sport landscape. And in Canada, of course, there's so much going on in sport right now. There'll be a Future of Sport Commission. Sport Canada is supporting a sport governance code that they're making mandatory for all organizations. So focusing on governance, focusing on leadership, and focusing on understanding, what are some of these structural flaws that are leading us to some of the challenges that we're facing right now, and rectifying some of those. So this is Jordan Aylesworth, and she's a clinical counselor that works with sport organizations and is an athlete herself. Katrina Monton, likewise, is working on her PhD, almost there, in organizational psychology. We have a Danielle Poulos, who is a mental performance consultant. That means that she works with teams to support the mental aspect of their performance, but also has a master's in science in this area. And Alana Lieberman, you've met before on this webinar. She's a lawyer who focuses on safeguarding and restorative justice in sport. And myself, of course, I have been talking about this kind of stuff for a while. And I work mostly with organizations around culture and leadership and do my research in this area as well, but also have a strong thread of research devoted to sport in particular because of the recent challenges that we've been facing within sport around culture and leadership. And so I'm excited to welcome them today, and I'll ask them to each introduce a little bit more about the roles that they play in sport right now and what kind of initiatives they're working on. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We know each other well, so it really will be a wonderful conversation where we'll be discussing some really big issues. We just had a little pre-conversation that I think was incredibly valuable. And we're constantly talking about what's going on in sport. So let's dive in. This is all about cultural integrity. So why don't we start first with talking about that? But before we dive into the actual questions we want to tackle, I do want to give our audience a chance to get to know you like I know you all. Tell us a bit about the roles that you're playing in sport. What sort of drawn you? What do you think your path has been into sport professionally as well? Anyone like to start? Katrina, you have your mic on, so why don't you get going and then we'll just go around the circle.
Okay, sure. So at the moment, I'm a doctoral student at Columbia University in New York, and my research is related to how organizational culture normalizes harm in high performance environments. And so right now I'm doing a study in sport, high performance sport, and in medicine as well, to see like those potentially the links in those cultures. And I do some work and consulting with sport organizations, mostly around the intersection between organizational psychology, which I don't know if I said that, but that's what I'm doing my doctoral studies in, organizational psychology. So I often work at the intersection between organizational psychology and kind of safe sport. So the role of culture and systems. And yeah, I'm an instructor, so I teach as well. And what's drawn me to sport, I swore I wouldn't come back into sport. So it's just funny how that happens. But I think I'm drawn back to it because I care deeply about it and I'm really passionate about it. I think there is a lot of room for development and borrowing and learning from other disciplines in the field of sport. And so that's kind of what's drawn me back into the space and working with these lovely people. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And Jordan, can you tell us a bit about your roles and your draw to sport as well?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a registered clinical counselor based in Victoria, and I've worked with athletes over the past 3 years now in my private practice, and really just supporting them through life as athletes and life as humans. And I've always had a really keen interest in high performance, so how humans who are high performing also stay well. So that's been my focus in my practice. And then similar to Katrina, I've done some consulting work with national sports organizations and university teams around, how do we keep that person at the forefront while also prioritizing performance. So have been, again, kind of intersecting, similar to Katrina's as well, intersecting my work as a counselor and then this idea of culture and how we all best operate within high performance systems. So yeah, I'm drawn to it because there are some really great people in sport, and within the system, there's so much potential. So that's what keeps me in it.
Love it. Thank you. And love how you touch on too, and we can get into this at some point, but there is a great discussion going on and clarification on the difference between mental health skills and mental performance skills, right? Which we obviously offer both here in this little group. Thank you. Danielle.
Yes, so I've been so happy to work with this group. Again, I've had a lot of positive experiences within sport, and particularly with working with people that like to collaborate. And I would say this group exemplifies that. So my sport experience started as an athlete in artistic swimming, and then moved to be a coach, official, volunteer, and worked overseas for a bit in different countries as a coach, and got to learn about their culture and their areas of sport in general, which was extremely interesting. In coming back to Canada, and have been working as a mental performance consultant for almost 20 years now. So sports psychology, I get to work with various national sport organizations and national team athletes. And then I also work as a consultant within culture and wellness. And what brought me into this area is that I have had very positive experiences in sport, but I also have worked with, alongside, and seen a lot of trauma and pain coming up from sport. And I really believe that there is that overlap between high performance sport and well-being, and I believe that is based in culture, and I strongly believe that Canada can embrace that and can get there. And so I do see, I'm passionate to be part of that, perhaps, discussion and hopefully movement towards that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it is so interesting how some of us come from having like brilliant experiences and come on, sport can be so great. And others have come from, yeah, that wasn't great. I want to fix it. And then we all kind of come together and realize both things need to happen. Thank you. And Alana.
Anything you want. So thank you, and thank you to this amazing group. I am so grateful to have met you all. I'm grateful to work with Danielle weekly, sometimes more, and so I'm really happy to be here. And so I come to sport from an interesting place. I grew up in a sports family, but I also was a competitive freestyle skier. I was a ballet skier. It doesn't exist anymore other than in memes and Instagram reels. But it's fun, and it created a love, as did my family. It created a love for sport and health. And a very long story. I became a lawyer after realizing I couldn't handle the science part of being a sports psychologist, which is what I really wanted to do. So I became a lawyer instead. And then focused on child protection law and did my master's in child protection law and constitutional law. And so, a very long story short, this job and the role that I play now is as Safe Sport Lead for Sport Nova Scotia. And so what it did when the job came up, actually it's 4 years ago this week, was it married my passions for sport and health and fitness and athletics with my passion and my work in child protection. And so it sort of encompasses that role, encompasses that. I also teach at Dalhousie. I teach a safe sport and ethics course. And where I believe where this passion comes from is not only my experiences in sport and my experience in child protection, but my passion to create a legacy. I have 2 children, and one is a high performance athlete down in the States, but and the other one has played sports his whole life. And my belief in creating a better, or helping to create a better future for them and their children, and then generations to come, is creating that legacy of a positive, healthy space in sport and rec and physical activity. That's where I come.
Beautiful. Thank you. So many important concepts there. I love that word legacy, eh? Something that will endure and sustain itself. So let's talk about cultural integrity. What is it? How do we achieve it? And how do you come at it? How do you approach it? What does it mean to you? Anybody like to start? Kick it off, and then I invite people to just build on what's being said.
Me, cultural integrity is demonstrated through our habits, our beliefs, our traditions within sport. That's, to me, how we can't always exactly see it because it's so nuanced. But those are, if we were to look anywhere, that's where we would uncover what the cultural integrity of that organization is.
Yeah, to build on that a little bit, I agree with Danielle, and it's how we live into that. And it's not only what we say, it's not only what's on paper, but cultural integrity is our commitment to living into those values. It's how it feels and how it sounds versus just how it looks. And the piece of integrity for me there is really just how loyal we are to it. We can create great culture, but if we don't exemplify that, if we don't live that, if that's not part of our everyday, then I don't feel it's true integrity.
And I can build on that. It's so neat, because what I've written down is giving meaning to the words. And so we see organizations, we see teams, we put values on board. And so I wrote down values of respect, dignity, and honesty, and transparency and accountability. Those were some of the words that came to my mind when I think about cultural integrity, excuse me. But what I really think, and Jordan, to your point, is living that. So we, and I think we were at a conference, Jen, where someone mentioned, you can put 42 values that, the organization may live by, but really, is that truly, do you live by them? Do you speak them? Does the organization, do the teams within the organization, truly live those and bring those every day in how they show up? And so I think that's really important. So it's one thing to have stated values, but to live them and to exemplify them, I think that's truly what integrity means. So yeah, it's a nice build.
Yeah, I wouldn't really add much. I think just echoing and amplifying that. I think it's something that is lived every day. It's in the environment. It happens on a day-to-day basis. And I think doing it with integrity, I think at first needs to be intentional. And I think that's where sometimes we're lacking a little bit potentially is you just get into these like everyday kind of habits, to borrow Danielle's word. And I think we can get a little bit far away sometimes from like what our intentions are. And so I think when you want to act with integrity, you really have to lean into that every day. And it's lived, like living your values, like I think what Alana and Jordan were mentioning.
Love that. Yeah, because habits can also become destructive, or right, we can fall into habits, or we can be intentional and they can have meaning. We can live into it, lean into it, all this language, very powerful. And Alana referenced, it was actually the new CEO of the Scouts, Boy Scouts, right? Or Scouts, I think they are generally now. But surfacing that while we have these values, actually one of the ones that was coming out was that people actually believed in that you had to experience harm in order to, so you can see how that would feed into some pretty dangerous territory, but that, you need to get a little bit hurt out there in the wilderness to really understand it. And is that really necessary? Like, let's examine that a little more. So maybe there's also this process of that intentional reflection on what do we really believe in as a group, and what do we really think is important, and that's an important process. So that leads into, how do we achieve the integrity? What work needs to be done so that people are intentionally and developing habits that reflect the values and all these things? What's it going to take in sport in particular? Let's just focus on sport. I mean, every organization needs to go through this, but sport's pretty unique. What do you think?
I can start off with this because again, I've written some notes and some ideas down, and I think that the group here will probably expand on it. But one of the comments was leadership and courageous leadership, and I think that's really important. And what does that mean to be a courageous and compassionate leader? I think we know what it doesn't mean, but what it does, to me, what that means is to include diverse people in conversations that may not have been invited before, but to make those conversations meaningful and to make their inclusion meaningful. And so it's not just about ticking boxes and making sure certain people are around the table, but making those conversations meaningful. I think that the other thing that I would say in terms of compassionate and courageous leadership is opening up to new possibilities. And I think that fear of that, I think I've mentioned to this group, sort of that's my mantra going forward, is what can we create together? So looking at maybe another C is collaboration, but in terms of leadership and in terms of voices around the table, but looking at what are the possibilities, what can we create? And I think you can do that, or one of the roads towards cultural integrity is if you have compassionate, courageous, and collaborative leadership. That's where I would start.
Truly collaborative. Yeah.
I would add to that. I think the first thing that came to mind for me was like truth. I think so often we're so quick to jump to like solutions and how can we do it? And I think building off of what Alana was saying, I think creating that space where those conversations can happen in a real and honest way. I think that those spaces are few and far between in sport. I don't think oftentimes athletes or other members and other stakeholders in sport truly feel that they can speak freely, openly, honestly, without a fear of retribution, of punishment, of being ostracized, and sometimes even ousted entirely, right, from the system. And so I think before we can even move to these things, in order to have integrity, we have to hold the mirror up a little bit. And I think that's scary to folks because I think the way things have been going, sometimes it has enabled some voices to be at the table continuously and consistently. And that in and of itself means that other voices have not been at the table. And so I think if we're truly going to create those spaces where that truth can be heard and held, and that's where the solutions are, right? It's not to jump to that immediately. So I think that was the first word I think that came to mind. And I think sometimes we go quickly into the check boxes of, I am safe sport trained. I've done the training. I've watched the videos. Therefore, I am, practicing or working with integrity. But the next day you might show up at practice, see something and not say anything. So is that really showing up with integrity and in terms of like cultural integrity, that's where those transgressions are happening. And so if we're not able to have that space to actually voice those things, have those honest and courageous conversations, to Alana's point, I think for me, that's like where I see that we would have to go, or that possibility could exist kind of in that space.
And let's lean in a little more on that, because it's a good example. And I think it really hits at the heart of, we talk about psychological safety that allows for the courage. And why is that important? Because then sport, right, is being open to criticism in order to then get better. And you've got to embrace it. And yet in our leadership spaces, we don't reflect what we do in sport. It's so crazy that there's this incongruity. Okay, but what are we afraid of? To be compassionate to these leaders who want to, snuff it all out and just keep status quo and keep it all nice. Why? What is the value of that? Or what are we afraid of happening if we allow people to be honest and really call out what's wrong or what's not working in the moment? If we bring it to the athlete level, why would a coach or an administrator be afraid of allowing an athlete or inviting an athlete to criticize?
Truthfully, I think it comes down to every individual's lack of vulnerability or safety, feeling able to be vulnerable. Because within the sports system, we've seen time and time again, if something is called out, if somebody is courageous, if at any level, really, whether it's leadership or whether it's the athlete, unless everybody else is on board to look at their contribution to that, it's just blame. And it's just considered, who did what wrong and how are we going to move forward from this? So I think to Katrina's point, to be able to have truth and to be able to be really honest about what's happening, there has to be vulnerability. And again, to tie power into this, there has to be vulnerability without losing position or losing, or maybe there should be loss of power, right? As I'm saying that, I think maybe there should be a dissemination of that power. I think a lot of people in sport are very scared to lose something, whether that's a position on a team, whether that's a position in an organization, whether that's ego or reputation, right? And it's like anything in life. If we can't get uncomfortable, if we can't look at, what's maybe embarrassing about this, or what maybe we did do something wrong, we're not going to be able to grow past that. So yeah, that word vulnerability really comes through as we're talking about this.
Well, and athletes have to accept not making the team. And sometimes you don't make it, or you get fired, or because you just didn't meet the standards. Hey, yeah.
I would also, with regard to vulnerability, it's also the acceptance of it. Sometimes there's just like, oh no, that's not true about me. So it's not just sometimes people can be vulnerable, but just not accept it as that not being true. And that's a challenge. And then if you take that one step further, I think some of the fear is that what's actually going to get done. And we see this in safe sport. We see this in leadership positions. If someone is going to take that risk and say that this isn't working and can we do it better? And I even have solutions. But there's also a real fear from others to not speak up. So it's typically one or maybe two people speaking up. And again, I've seen this at all levels. There's no accountability at the other end. So if someone does speak up, what is done with that information or that challenge is very limited, and it's a very long process. And I would hazard a guess that at the end of the day, that person's going to leave in some way or another before any real change is made.
Paralyzing. And so if we want to create an environment where people are open, they welcome criticism, we understand that we must be open in order to get better. I mean, that's sport. That is sport. I don't understand why a leader can't embrace that and lean into it. and create that same kind of environment where we're constantly challenging each other and the system and how we're doing things together. Get back to Danielle's point about some people just are not willing to accept the criticism though. Why not? What threatens them? What makes them scared about that or worries them, concerns them about that?
I don't know if it was Jordan or Katrina, but I think loss. I think that loss of power,
Yeah.
loss of job, loss of meaning, loss of reputation, this loss overshadows the desire to move forward. So it's the fear of as opposed to the desire to. And so I think if we think about it, maybe it starts with the 5 and then it starts with the 50 to 5,000 people who are going to watch this. And maybe we try and flip. I think, and the people who are working in this space are really trying to say, okay, we need to move forward. We know that. I think that's a given. So maybe it's moving from loss of to what can we create, the desire to change. And so maybe that thought process has to change a little bit. What do we want to move to? As opposed to what are we to lose?
And I think too, like acknowledging that with learning and growth comes discomfort. And I think I've seen like psych safety be wielded by those in power and privilege to say, like, I'm not comfortable, I can't have this conversation. But sometimes it's like just acknowledging that athletes are uncomfortable every day. They're pushed to the limits physically, emotionally, like on every level of being, spiritually, they're pushed to like those extremes. And so it's just what a privilege to sit in a position of power and not feel and not feel discomfort. And I think we've gotten kind of away from that like learning comes from discomfort. It comes from courage, being brave, hearing things. And I think there's another piece of it too, where it's like, I think right now we're at this place of like polarization where we can't fathom or hold the complexity of two truths being true. If my truth is true, it doesn't take away from your experience and your truth. I think there is complexity there. And I think sometimes folks can't really hold that complexity, that if her experience in sport was this, how can my job or my role or my experience be this? Like, it must be that her experience isn't true or isn't true on some level. But I think many perspectives can be held as true at the same time. And that's uncomfortable too. So maybe we need to get a little uncomfy to push ourselves a bit. I don't know.
Well, you and I were reading that article about psych safety and how it can be misunderstood to mean comfortable. And it isn't. It's about being comfortable with discomfort. Yeah. So spreading the word more, right? Flipping the script so that we're seeking a kind of power to leadership rather than over. You're not supposed to be the heroic know-it-all. You're supposed to be the facilitator that is very skillful. Yeah. And just keep pushing for this different kind of approach. Hey, that's vulnerable. The boxers talk about it being tough to be vulnerable. Not a great little phrase. You're actually tough when you're vulnerable, but it's also very difficult to be vulnerable. Love the double meaning. Okay. Any more comments on that? To be compassionate to those who are trying to hold their power and don't want to get canceled for good reason and all these things, but at the same time, we need to push for a different mindset around.
Yeah, the word control comes to mind for me as we're talking about this. And I wonder if it's an ability to be vulnerable and uncomfortable, but also to let go of that control. That keeps us safe, right? Whether it's in work or personal relationships, control allows us to ease our anxiety and feel like we have say in something or the outcome. And recently working with actually a really awesome leader in sport, I said to him, the way you run your team is allowing them to have so much control, right? Like your team of people, you can get uncomfortable and give that away because you're sure of yourself and what you're doing. And it's pretty cool to see those instances where somebody isn't holding control tight. They trust other people, they trust themselves to be able to handle a situation. So I wonder how control plays into all of this, especially in positions of leadership and power.
That's beautifully put. And I think, again, if we can amplify that concept that you're actually more confident, you demonstrate greater confidence when you can relinquish control. it requires confidence, but also really communicates a lot of confidence and trust. Control is a myth, right? We actually have no control over anything. Look at that windstorm happening, and we can't try and get a 2-year-old to put their shoes on. It's impossible. You can't control people, and you take away their power when you try. So, oh, all right, we know all the answers. But we're all stuck still, right? We're still struggling to get this paradigm out there. What else is required to spread the word and help it take hold more?
Honestly, I think a clear vision of where are we going towards, what are we trying to achieve, instead of it just being, okay, we know we need to do these things, but why? And the buy-in to that why is essential for us to make those changes. So we have I think a pretty clear understanding of where we are. I feel like we have an understanding of what needs to change, but in order for that change to happen, motivation has to be there for people. And I think of that as, what's the vision, and where are we at, what's our goal here, and where are we moving towards in sport and in high performance sport in Canada. And I think that needs to be really clear.
Let's talk about it, right? That's next on our list. We've discussed a few things we want to touch on today, and the dream for sport in Canada. What is that vision? There's a burning platform, but there's also that idea of what's the pull, what's pulling us. I find that very valuable as a researcher, when I'm in the weeds of all the harm and destruction, to keep my eyes up on what are we actually trying to create together, to use Alana's phrase. Well, what do you think? And Alana actually suggested a great exercise. Maybe you want to attribute this to whoever it was that introduced you to it, Alana, of the sensory exercise that we can try as well. Go for it.
I've done this in a few spaces. I know I've done this with some work with True Sport. I did it in a session in preparation, for the North American Indigenous Games, and we talked about the word safe because I work as a safe sport lead, and what does that feel like? What does that look like? What does that taste like? What does it sound like? And so when we think about the values, and we talked, like, rewinding to our initial conversations and how this shows up every day, how the values that we're talking about show up every day. So we think about, okay, well, what does, the value of, let's say it's truth, what does it feel like? What does it feel like when someone experiences that? And what does it, when we think about sport in general, what is good sport? What is positive sport? What does great sport feel like? What does it taste like? And so, in my mind, and we've talked about this as a group, laughter. Oh my goodness. I mean, yes. And to everybody's point, yes, absolutely. Sport is sacrifice. Sport is hard work. It's pushing limits, but it can be really fun. So to me, and I know we are all as a group going to explore this in the future, but laughter and smiles and friendships and legacy. And so to me, like that's just one example. So I'll let my friends take it along, but yeah.
Love that, right? And to learn from sport, we've all probably had experiences as athletes or as people doing sport or any kind of recreation where you've felt that the truth and the honesty and the vulnerability, but also the hard work and the focus and the discomfort and the aspiration, trying, and maybe failure and loss as well, but all those things together. And maybe that's our greatest source of those sensory things we can identify that could then be introduced to the organizational setting, the boardroom, the administrative offices, the leadership discussions. Imagine. Okay, what comes to mind for people? Let's start with something a little bit uncomfortable. Like, what does it smell like when you've been in those environments? What does truth and honesty and vulnerability, intensity smell like?
It smells a little bit like sweat.
I was going to say that.
It's hard being vulnerable. It is hard having difficult conversations. It is normal to feel anxious and uncomfortable in those situations. It is normal to sweat in those conversations. We sometimes think about sport and we are expecting to have quote unquote normal reactions to things, but what sport asks of us is very often abnormal. And so we have to also normalize that we're going to have abnormal that the requirements are abnormal, and that our reactions to those, like anxiety, like sweating, are normal and are somewhat to be expected.
I'm thinking locker rooms and pool decks, and even just in the boat under, in the heat of Ontario, and that, you're just going through so much. It's so great, but God, that smell of the heat, the track, right? And maybe that points us to that these leaders need to also be in touch with that. Like, make sure they're staying in touch with what they're leading as well. Yeah. What else? What do you smell? Other stuff?
My mind goes to more of the administrative environment separate to the DTE, but it smells fresh, like not these stuffy old boardrooms. There's vibrancy, there's a freshness, there's a finger on the pulse of what's really going on. We're not stuck 20 years ago with old furniture and musky smells. We're in fresh spaces and innovative spaces, diverse spaces. Yeah, that's where my mind goes to.
I really like that, actually, and I hadn't thought of that at all. But now that you say it, like, to me, and I run a bit. I don't always consider myself a runner, but it smells like fresh sneakers, and the possibility of what you can accomplish in those sneakers. And I mean, that can be used like a fresh stick for hockey, or fresh basketball for basketball. Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
Such a great feeling.
fresh. I love that. That's great.
I want to hear from the water polo.
I was thinking chlorine.
I know, that's what I'm thinking.
But I was thinking like chlorine, grass, and then I was thinking kind of like outside, like the fresh air. Like there's nothing like when you go outside and it's like getting warmer after like the winter, and then you can feel the sun and you can feel it like and smell it. And it's, yeah. So I think connecting with outdoors too, like we always love training, like in the summer, you smell sunscreen. And I think the summer was always like just such a fun time to be training because we were able to be outside. And I think there's a connection there between like doing sport and doing it like in the environment. So, yeah.
And the skier in our midst.
Yeah, the outdoors and fresh snow and all of that. I'm going to take a little bit of a different organizational spin on this, and so we'll see where this lands. And I'm not sure, but because I'm just thinking about it, but I do, and this group will know, but I do work in restorative justice, and I've just completed a program in restorative justice. And one of the things in terms of getting people in a room together and bringing in different voices is this notion of breaking bread together. And so when I think about coming together, and to Jordan's point about sort of the stuffy and removing that, and maybe it's from an organization, it could be from a team, but maybe it's fresh baked goods. Maybe it's that we're going to break bread, we're going to sit around together, and we're going to talk, and we're going to maybe get uncomfortable, and we're going to share a meal, we're going to share muffins. And so if you ever come to my meetings, I'm usually bringing food because that's how I roll. But I'm just wondering if maybe when we think about moving forward and we think about smell of possibility, maybe it's breaking bread together. I don't know. Trying that on for size here.
Think about, when you've been part of teams, and a lot of the fun of the team, or the real kind of connection you're making, or the reflective pieces, are when you're with your buddies and eating constantly, right? Trying fueling.
Yeah. And maybe we translate that into meetings about big ideas, and we break bread and we break healthy food together. I don't know.
The best boards I've been on have been able to go out for dinner together, right? And have that element to our interaction and become human. The humanity, I'm seeing nature, lots of this idea of space, but also the hard work of it and the intensity of it. Right on. Okay, what about visually? What are you envisioning for a sport system that embodies and embraces all of these things. Draw from those positive experiences. What have you seen?
Laughter to the yeah, like smiles. I see people being physically connected. Physically connected. I see positive body language. But I also do see, you know, it is important for people to experience failure. And so we will, I think it's also important that we normalize that, yeah, failure is a big part of it too, but that it becomes about the learning versus the failing.
Finger pointing. I was part of a wonderful strategic planning process with rowing where, and a giant, you know, one of those big conference rooms, but big high ceilings, which gives you just a, and everyone working around their tables in really diverse groups, like all sorts of different places from Canada were coming together and but working as little collaborative groups, and then things being put on the wall and drawing, and so much action and energy. It was really productive, but confronting real issues as well and tackling them honestly. And yeah, it was cool, just all the energy of that, right? Focused.
I was just thinking, I feel like the human moments in sport, like just like I think so often there's a lot of dehumanization. And I think those human moments are like what remains, like what stays after, whether it's like connecting with teammates, hearing your national anthem, singing your national anthem, crying together, whether it's like happy tears or sad tears. So I think there's something there about like seeing the humanness in sport and how incredible athletes are incredible human beings ultimately. And so there's something there about like not forgetting that. So a vision just of like a really human centered sports system, I guess, or just, I don't know, humanizing sport in some way. I don't know. That's like what that's like what kept like resonating for me. I don't know if that's even a fully baked thought, so maybe someone else can pick it up. But that's kind of what I was thinking about.
I'm picturing 2020, or sorry, Alana, I'm picturing 2010 when the women and men's hockey teams won. I remember feeling like the world would end if they didn't win. But also loving the moment when these, you know, superstars, the throwing down of the gloves and all these boys, you know, suddenly reduced to little boys coming together because it was so close, right, for the guys. And I thought, oh, there's that little picture I have, or that beautiful moment in Tokyo when the two guys shared the high jump medal, and how the guy jumped on his buddy, right? Just these beautiful, emblematic of how gorgeous these people are. Yeah, highlighting.
Yeah. And like the like Canadians, like the patriotism, like when you said about the hockey thing, like I had a vivid memory of the mittens. Like the mittens became like a huge thing, and it was the thing that everyone wanted to have the mittens because it would connect them to these superhuman beings that were on TV, whether they won or lost. Like I feel like they were everything to everybody. And so like when you were saying that, I was just vividly brought back to like those mittens, like everyone had them. And so yeah, totally.
So
It's so interesting, Jen, as you were talking and Katrina about those moments and the human moments, and Jen, you brought a couple, and I literally got shivers. And so when we talk about feeling like that shiver, and but that is that connectedness, and I think we might end up talking about that in some of our values, but that connectedness where we feel connected with our teams, where we feel connected with each other, and you know, you could be in Victoria and you could be in New York, but we are connected through this, and there is that connectedness that I feel like, you know, with where we are now, it's sort of taken on an individualistic, but that connectedness that brings us together, that gives us shivers or, you know, vivid memories or smiles of things that did bring us together as a nation. So feeling, seeing, hearing, remembering, all of that is so important. So yeah.
I think what I'm hearing a lot of is pride, is hearing and seeing pride.
Yeah, part of something bigger than ourselves. Beautiful. All right. So we've had it, right? We've experienced these things. And so it's about bringing them back into focus and then aspiring, keeping that, holding that vision up there fully. Because I think right now the polarization, like it's like, well, if it's all about safe sport, it's going to take away so much. No. We've had that. We have to have all of it, all of it. Okay, let's keep going. What's the next thing, Alana? You can think about feelings, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that feeling of just, I don't know, either goosebumps or shivers or chill bumps or someone, I don't know, that pride, as Danielle was saying. And hearing laughter and hearing connections, hearing stories and sharing memories. I haven't seen some of my teammates for a really long time, but I can connect with them on social media, on Facebook, and sharing, and tapping into some memories, and most of them were very positive. And so, but not taking away from some, that weren't, and certainly in my experience. But yeah, memories, it's so interesting, right? They can evoke really, really strong feelings and evoke, I guess, and I'm not an expert in this, but a lot of the senses. And so I think that's an interesting, when we go through this exercise, that might be interesting. But I do feel like one of the things that we when we talk about the vision that we want and how to get there, because I think that's an important part, this connectedness. I think we need to tap into connectedness and what that means. So.
Right, what it feels like. What does that feel like for people? Or comes to mind, Jordan?
There's an element of the feeling being sustained for me, because I think we get tastes of all these feelings. As we're talking about these moments, we can all viscerally feel the shivers or that excitement or that pride. But then what happens, right? Does the feeling last beyond that moment on the TV, or does that feeling extend the next day in the half pipe? How does that continue? And I think, for me, thinking about those feelings, that unity, that connectedness, that inclusion, that representation has to be continual. It has to be not just in those moments of either failure, which often brings us together, or success. It's everything in between too. So yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, what does it feel like in the moment, and then and where do those feelings go? What happens to those feelings afterwards?
I'm part of, we all are, you're part of these kind of alumni groups or groups that have gone through something similar, but maybe not at the same time, but it's quite remarkable. For me, that's that feeling of this incredible web and connection, and where I've actually never met the person, but we feel like we know each other because we've gone through something kind of similar, whether it's a sport or an event, or whatever. But that's a pretty neat thing where you're part of something that's been identified, a kind of a clubby thing. So putting energy into identifying what those unifying things are, whether it's all about the mittens. Did you have the mittens? Do you still have your Commonwealth 1986 tracksuit? Because a lot of people sure have them in Victoria. But it unified, right? I was part of that volunteer group, or I was part of, which is sport. I mean, you got the uniform, you got the thing, right? Yeah.
Think it was like brought back to like childhood playing sports, like putting on your soccer uniform, your cleats, pulling up your socks over your shin pads, and like your shirt's really big, and you're just so excited to go, and you're basically not even really playing soccer, but your parents come and watch you, and you get orange slices, and it's just so much about community and team and seeing your friends and having fun. And I think so much of why we go into sport are the feelings that, to Jordan's point, like I wish we could like bottle up and keep throughout, even though the goal might change or the vision might change. I feel like those feelings when you first start playing sport, it's so much fun, and you can't do enough sport. You know, you're like doing soccer, gymnastics. It doesn't matter if your body type is right for any of it. It doesn't matter, you know, like, it doesn't matter what your hair looks like. It doesn't matter, like, nothing really matters other than participating for that hour, that 2 hours. And I think that feeling, I wish we could like capture that feeling, because I think that is something that would, if we could sustain something like that, that'd be pretty great.
Sport for life, hey? Yeah.
Sport and fun.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that picture that you described, because I think probably everybody has had that, or certainly wants it. I love it.
Your point, Katrina, makes me think of, you know, that excitement and when we dive into sport and we just can't get enough of it, it also allows us to feel like we're escaping some other things. You know, a lot of folks get into sport as an outlet or as a release or as a way to be in a really positive environment when maybe other parts of their life aren't that positive. And so that feeling of relying on something to give us that safety, that excitement, that rush of endorphins, and being able to feel that, because I think it sometimes gets flipped. You know, we get it when we're thinking about that soccer situation. You know, we all probably have smiles on our faces of, oh, that's so great. But then it shifts into expectation, it shifts into performance, success, all these things that it ends up creating that stress in our life versus being a way to get away from stress in our life. So that feeling of just freedom and yeah, escaping, you know, some of the harsher realities of life too. I think it's like an art form, right? We're able to connect to this when we need something to connect to. And I think that awesome feeling of sport does the same.
And crucial for us, I think we're facing in high performance sport. This is one of the things that we're really, really struggling with. Hey, that how do you maintain or retain the spirituality of sport and not let it disappear? That it is a sanctity, it's solace, it's beauty. And you hear many of our high performing athletes talk about it like that, that it is this, I mean, I certainly feel still that way, but even during those years of my life, it was so, it was exactly what you described, right? An outlet, but a sanctity. Keep going. Let's keep going. I'm writing all these things down so we can tell the minister, because the commission, really, this is what they need to seek out, right? And then try to figure out how to preserve it. People from all over our community can inform that, but these are the things we can't compromise on them. Belonging, the sustained, the actual purity of sport. We can't lose sight of that. Love, emotion, connection, community, fun. We'll talk about the F word. That's gonna be our first article, everybody. What's something, okay, if we talked about taste? Yes, no, a little bit. No, we talked about smell, smelling the food that we might be eating together. And hearing, we need to do those two. Let's talk about taste. That's an interesting one, right? What do you taste? What tastes come to mind when you think of that really holistic sport environment system?
Now I can't stop thinking about baked goods and sweat.
Yeah.
And those are the easy ones, right? Because we right there associate, but you can taste fresh air, right? You can taste a snowflake. I mean, I guess not, but maybe you can. But you know, from I don't know. It's an interesting one.
I was thinking about the orange slices, like, because I never eat orange slices anymore. But as a kid in soccer, you always have orange slices. Now I'll peel my oranges, but sometimes I maybe do cut it up for nostalgia. But I think it's about the oranges, but it's also about the communal eating of the oranges, right? Like it's about going for ice cream after the game, or we used to have swim meets like in the West Island of Montreal, like where I'm from. And after the swim meets, we would go to like whoever wanted to from the same pool would go to like dinner if they wanted to. And so just like the eating and eating regardless if you win or lose, right? Like you're still going to nourish your body. So, and that was really salient before when Alana shared about breaking bread. I thought of just like the nourishment of sport, like what sport could be. It could be nourishing. And I think it touches on like many of these senses. But I keep thinking about the orange slices, which I think that memory that I like brought up is just salient at the moment. But I think the orange slices obviously are representing something more.
Beautiful,
Think of water fountain water.
right?
It's usually like, I mean, from my experience as an athlete, even just getting water, it was done, we would go together. There was a water break. It was time where we actually like debriefed something or had a conversation that was totally not relevant to what we were doing at the time. And that's sometimes, again, coming back to that connection, I find like, and some bringing it to like organization and work, you know, we talk about the water fountain, everyone around the water fountain talking about their weekend and connecting around the water fountain. And I feel like that is pretty, like the water breaks or the water fountain, to me, it's water.
Unstructured, informal too, right? So important to have that piece, recovery, the nourishment.
What I think is really cool about everything that just was brought up is that nothing was singular. So we didn't imagine eating a piece of orange by ourselves. We didn't imagine breaking bread by ourselves. We're going to the water fountain by ourselves. And there's a really interesting research study where two participants were given the same piece of chocolate or chocolate bar, I think it was, and put in two separate rooms. And they were asked to describe their experience of eating that chocolate. Said it was great, tasted fine. Then they were put in the same room, two people with the exact same chocolate bar. And they described, they were not to speak, they just sat in the same room, both participants, and they described the second chocolate bar being better, tasting better than the first one.
Okay.
So kind of cool to recognize that our experience of something is amplified with other people.
And to take that like to a systems perspective, we can think about like the taste of sport for people that just love watching sport and like love to be fans and go and watch games and like have beers together during games and won't miss a game, and they'll get free chicken wings if the team scores a number of goals. And I think like so much of that too is like, it's not, yes, it's about watching the game, but there's something about like community and communal, like communal about watching the game together and cheering for a team together. Like, so sport can be so unifying in that way. Around food, clearly. But I'm okay.
Seems to have taken on a tangent about food, so we might have to do a baking webinar or something like that.
Yeah.
But just, I think this, you know, comes back to connectedness and community, and I think all of what we're all talking about is that connectedness and community, and I wonder if that's sort of where things have maybe have shifted. And so if that's, you know, if that is one of our goals, how do we get back there? How do we get back to that connectedness and community? And I think, Katrina, to your point, you know, you can meet, you know, my favorite sports team, you meet someone and you don't know this person, but you connect immediately and you start, and what an amazing just connection to meet someone who cheers for the same random team that you do. And that's so neat when that happens. So, yeah, it's beautiful.
At rugby tournaments, rugby sevens tournaments, they're pretty different, and people dress up, but there's a ton of beer. And actually, sometimes it's really cold, and the guys will be walking around with the beer, and they'll shift to warm beer instead of cold beer, and then just so funny and crazy and wild. But it's a cultural festival too, because people will sit in their countries, but also just interact like crazy around the food trucks, right? But it's this unification, I think, of the world in those kind of environments, right? So you feel like you belong to this global community too. So beautiful, because you're all cheering for different teams, but you're part of rugby. So fun.
This might extend into our next point. Sorry, Jen, to cut you off. I was just thinking, again, on this food tangent, I promise it'll be the last thing. I remember hearing for the athletes village in Paris that there was going to be a patisserie. So that's part of the athletes village. There was going to be this bakery, and when we think about connecting over something, and also culturally, how do we identify with something, whether it's the mittens or a croissant, or I think it could challenge us all to think about Canadian values and Canadian cultural artifacts that we connect to when we're talking about all this. So through any of the senses, what does that look like, taste like, feel like? Because I remember hearing, oh my gosh, it's so French, right? It's so French that of course you would have a bakery as part of the offerings. So anyways, just as a side thought, as we go into this next topic.
Because that is cultural. So thanks so much for bringing that up, right? Like, so if we're actually thinking about achieving this vision in all its forms, we didn't talk much about hearing yet, but I think the diverse voices, the energy, one thing that we need to think about is, what are those ritualistic foods that we associated with it? Growing, it was always about eating as much as you could, but pasta would kind of support that, and we'd have these pasta pig outs, and it was always about carbo loading. But not every sport has that. You think about the old hockey players talk about eating steak and potatoes before their game, but these are ritualistic. They're artifacts that we associate with. And I think that is a big gap in our country, where we're not really, I know in many sports, they tend to look elsewhere and try to emulate instead of really surface, what is it about Canada? The mittens are a really good artifact of that too. That was so unifying. Volunteerism, kindness and politeness. Yet we're not afraid to, remember that commercial about opening up a can of whoop-ass when they headed down to the States, right, for Salt Lake. Yeah. Okay, what are those artifacts that we could better leverage to help us bring structure, or bring a concrete form to connection, belonging, unification, diversity, which is huge, geographical expansiveness, right? It's so Canadian.
I can start. I think, Jen, you just highlighted one that strikes me as kindness. I think Canadians very much are known for kindness. I know that, moving to the East Coast, I had not known the kind of kindness that existed, certainly up in Central Canada. But anyways, no, and I think, I think it is throughout the country, and I think we are known for that, and politeness, and the jokes about saying sorry. But I think that we can take the joke out of it, but kindness. And so if we focus on kindness and respect and dignity as core values, which I think hopefully they're related, that those values will guide us to the future. So I think it's not an artifact per se, although you could probably find them, but kindness, dignity, and respect would be, I think, Canadian cultural, again, not artifacts, so I'm not using, maybe values.
And the artifacts are those stories of the guy that gave the ski to the Norwegian skier, and we have lots of those, the sailors that helped, and yeah. But sustained with the other truth of our intensity. The fact that hockey, it isn't the Canadian sport, but we try to own it, and how intense and violent it can be. How can we leverage that in a way that's dignified, that reconciles with our desire to be generous and open and kind?
That's maybe where respect comes into play, is, can we have that intensity? Can we have that passion while also respecting the other side, the other person involved? There was something I was thinking when we were talking about how could sport in Canada sound, is those respectful conversations. And that doesn't mean that they're all, happy topics. There's a matter of respect and acknowledging that, again, we're dealing with another person here, and so maybe within that kindness, It's respecting how our actions might impact somebody else. And again, I think to this whole two truths, we don't have to go to either end of the spectrum, right? We don't need to be completely kind and therefore hand our medal to another athlete. There can be a space in between where we still reach for that performance, where we still strive for that excellence while also maintaining that dignity, respect, and kindness that Alana spoke of.
I think sometimes we need to also make the distinction between kind and polite. And I think we need to move more towards kindness than politeness, because we are known as a country to be polite, but sometimes to not to our benefit, and saying sorry when really we shouldn't be saying sorry, actually, which is we're saying it. And so being kind, and I think kindness, in what I'm hearing from different athletes, from different organizations, from different people in the sports system, one thing that's really clear is transparency is kindness. It's being transparent about criteria, being transparent about decisions, being transparent about timelines, and having those conversations when you like having a clear timeline and following through with those actions. And I think that perhaps we need to redefine what kindness is, or be really explicit about what kindness is. But that's what I'm hearing a lot of. And you're not always going to hear what you want to hear, but you're going to hear what you need to hear in that moment. And then you're able to make a plan around that or strategies around that. But if there's that constant feeling of uncertainty or unknown, which obviously there's going to be some degree in life, obviously, but where we can be transparent and provide that information and over communicate that information, people are going to be able to digest that and move forward in some form of way. And that in and of itself is kind, because we're not spending our mental space in that gray zone of what if this happens, or what if that happens, or maybe they're looking at this, or maybe they're going to make the decision based on that. And that is stressful, and constantly being in that headspace when improvements certainly can be made in that area. Of course, we're always going to have some of that. But I do think that idea of transparency and communication and kindness in my head makes sense as to how we can be kind in the sports system.
I think it's Brene Brown that says clear is kind. So it's like, that's what came to mind for me too. Is like, that's actually what kindness is. It's exactly what you just said, Danielle.
Honesty, transparency. Okay. And still, we can still be respectful and intense. We can still challenge one another. I mean, that is being truthful, courageous. Okay. Because I think we also tend to be bystanders as Canadians. We're so polite that we're afraid to challenge, and we hold back, thinking that we're protecting the norms, or being polite and kind to the person with, we don't want to cancel them or critique just yet, but we end up being bystanders and allowing things to unfold, which is Sheldon Kennedy respect group, the focus on respect. I mean, he's really nailed it. I don't think he gets himself out there enough, frankly, but he's focusing on bystander training as the most important aspect of this, bringing sport back to where it needs to be, which is all about telling the truth, speaking up, being courageous. Okay. We also, I think, similarly, are group thinkers. Will preserve harmony over the actual insight and solution. Very dangerous, right? I mean, it led to the Bay of Pigs. It's led to the NASA crashes, right? Self-censoring instead of speaking up. Okay, love it. A little more on that, a little more on this idea of, the cultural values of Canadians that we could leverage a little better, make a little more concrete, or reconcile so it actually works for us instead of against us? What about the violence? Where does that come from, do you think? I mean, I always think about the voyageurs and how tough they had to be. But that doesn't mean they were violent necessarily. They probably were, but how do we tease out what is good about the intensity of that without it being harmful?
I think we kind of value ourselves of being just good people that, I'm in the States and, oh, you're Canadian, you're a good person. You must be a good person. And I think we're rule followers. And I think sport generally comes from a place of violence, aggression, war. Like if we really trace back the Olympic Games, ancient times, it literally was a battle to the death to prepare men to go to war. Women's experiences were not included at all. And so I think we see those threads throughout history of sport. And as good stewards of sport in Canada, I think we have endorsed that in a way that is obviously there's many factors, but potentially we want to be good stewards of all things. And I wonder if there's an element of that, of like embracing that culture as other nations have also done. I think we're seeing this on like a global scale at the moment. But to your point, Jen, of like, self-censoring and groupthink, and it's just a lot easier to go with the status quo than to challenge it and to say, hey, what would hockey look like without that? Oh my God, God forbid we even ever say that. We're saying this on this webinar, but like we may get backlash. But it's like, I think there is something there about like the culture of being like good people. And I truly believe we are good people, but I think maybe some of that goes along with going with the status quo rather than challenging it. Or obviously I'm simplifying it quite a bit here, and trying to connect it to the Canadian system specifically. But I do think this is also happening on like a more global kind of scale. But I think this is the way sport's been done traditionally for a long, long, long time.
And people love that. Amy Evanson talks about this too, about how people love status quo because it's stability. It seems like stability, right? It provides a lot of valuation too of how things have been done, because people don't want to necessarily let go of, because then that means maybe we were wrong. And so without judgment, how do we evolve the violence into something less harmful? I mean, we know concussions are not good. Breaking someone's neck isn't a good idea. So I come back to rugby because I feel like there's been a lot of effort to transform violence into aggression and tackling that's actually designed to preserve the health of the other person around. So tackling correctly. Hits can be done in hockey correctly without involving, cross check. So, and they know that, and it's coming, and there's much more information about concussion too. So I do feel like it's moving, but there still are quite a few people digging their heels in around fighting in hockey and actual targeted hits. You watch it in Twitter all the time. Jordan, what do you think?
My mind goes to, a mental health perspective of if that violence is a form of aggression versus intensity or passion. And again, I come back to that human that is in that situation aggressing their anger or frustration, or there's a very big difference between that and actually wanting to harm somebody else because of our personal state, right? If we feel like we need to inflict harm or we need to pass that on to somebody else versus properly hitting somebody or properly as a part of the game, as a part of the sport. A lot of athletes deal with so many mental health issues that come out in these aggressions because they don't know how to channel it, and they don't know how to self-regulate, and they don't know how to deal with their anxiety or their anger. So that can come out in a lot of these displays of violence or aggression. And in a perfect world, what would it look like for a hockey team to regulate? Like what would that look like? Would that ultimately eliminate fighting? Right? It doesn't mean that they all need to get along, but those acts of bravado and ego and I gotta really destroy this other person? Is that more about us and what we're going through, or is that more about the sport itself?
Hmm.
Can you imagine if people jumped out of the pool and started fighting on the side of a water polo game, or the side of the court for volleyball? Like, it just seems so crazy, right? So, yeah. But
Jen, sorry, just to interrupt to that point. I mean, how many times when a fight breaks out on the ice, or if there's a bench clearing brawl in a baseball game, does the crowd just absolutely, that's probably the most, it could be for some the most exciting part of it. So I think it's
Mhm.
what we know and what we're talking about, and it's a massive shift in our thinking. And to Jordan and Katrina's point, or points, it's sort of groupthink, sort of opposite, I guess, maybe. And again, when we think about the crowds and what is, paying, and we could get into a whole, the business of sport and all of that. But it is sort of reminding that concussions are bad, breaking limbs on purpose for the sake of breaking someone's limb is bad. And so, yeah, there is a whole cultural shift in thinking about that. So,
Yeah.
and to Jordan's point about sport actually offers us an opportunity. Again, I just think it's such a great model at its best. So it actually also offers us this opportunity to teach the skills of regulation, channeling, how to channel aggression in a way. I mean, I think of basketball, and I was always post. So posting up is very physical, and it's about exerting power and dominance and staking your claim in the key, etc. And you're pushing them around. But I'm not, as soon as someone, elbowed me, and then I want to lose it, and then it becomes violence, right? Then it becomes about anger. But this other piece is actually kind of a joyful sparring with the person that you're playing with. It feels good, and you appreciate one another, and you'll kind of love it. The contact is really exciting. So helping people get it, right, is going to be a big part. But the fan piece is going to be a big problem to solve, because that's culture writ large.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. I think like one thing in terms of like normalization of harm in sport, I think that's one thing that sport is up against that is going to be really, really hard, just because of the romanticization and sensationalization, or it's so sensationalized, it's so romanticized on TV. You watch a documentary, even if it's positive about sport, and you see certain things. And for everyday viewers, lovers of sport that aren't necessarily participating in sport, like that's what they've come to learn and know of good sport. That's what they've come to learn and think is necessary, despite there being absolutely no evidence of that. So I think that is going to be really challenging, because that will require change on a societal level, in terms of, like viewership and that stuff. I think we're, culture beyond just in Canada.
Yep. But you think of these big cultural shifts around norms like seatbelts or smoking, or, behavioral shifts are possible. And it usually has to do with shifting what is acceptable as a norm and what's cool. It starts to become cool to wear the seatbelt or not drink and drive or whatever. Okay, so there's hope. And this education and amplification of these concepts, but being really clear about what those are and working hard to inform the redesign. Cool. I want to finish off by talking about power balance, because this idea of overpowering, we've talked about power kind of in a nuanced way all throughout our conversation, but really, as soon as you have this power imbalance, when the coach is the dominant or the administrator exerts some sort of fear dominance, people are going to be afraid to speak. Like, now we don't have that psychologically safe space where people are actually going to learn, challenge each other and the system as a whole. Like, even us, we feel a bit like you're taking a bit of a risk calling out violence in hockey, because the hordes are going to speak out, right? How do we structure that into our system? How do we where are the power imbalances, and where do you think we could achieve greater power balance? So, for example, I'm thinking of Athletes Can right now. So now they're funded by Sport Canada. They came to be, many of my colleagues were part of the initial group, came to be as kind of an athlete council, right, for athletes in Canada in general, and to be that voice and to organize athletes. Imagine if all athletes linked arms, how powerful that would be, right? And to counteract some of those oppressive forces. But now they're being funded, and we like funding, right? But then that kind of puts them against the ropes a little. Now, are they going to challenge the hand that feeds them as equally, which is not always an intentional power imbalance move or tactic, but it tends to result in the same old thing where now there's they're in a position of less authority. How can we rectify that? Where else does that exist in our system?
I think, like, to tackle that power imbalance question, one of the things that I've thought about in general is just our sports system in general, and the fact that it's so siloed, and that there's a lack of collaboration across. Sometimes there's a lack of awareness, not only lack of collaboration amongst organizations in the sports system. And I would liken it to not just there's too many cooks in the kitchen, but there's too many cooks in the kitchen making a different meal, and not knowing what each other is making, and it's a 5-course meal. And so it's these cooks have great intentions and have a lot of passion and maybe can make a wonderful meal, but it's gonna taste terrible with whatever that other cook is cooking up in that same kitchen. And so if you think about those cooks being the leaders or the people with, like, having that power imbalance, then it creates not only just a power imbalance within an organization, but it creates also lack of collaboration and alignment with people that are underneath those cooks. And that creates a lot of challenges when trying to collaborate with other organizations or with other people in the sport field, because it's like, oh, well, my cook isn't aligning with your cook and they're cooking something different and we have different things. And so, no, you guys can't actually align on that. And so I think, again, there is that power imbalance, but that power imbalance also and the siloed organizations also impact how well people in the sports system overall work together.
Which is the point of distributed power, distributed leadership, is so that we can all work together to co-create, learn as a system, challenge each other. So we're challenging up instead of dominating and pushing down. I see a lot of competition in the sports system too, and so they're protecting what they're cooking. I don't want to share because our meal needs to be better than yours, so we get the 5 stars or whatever. Yeah.
And just, I guess this has taken on a sort of food focus.
We must be hungry.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We're going to figure this out. And I see another, after our F word blog, I see another one in the future about food. There may be a whole theme, but there are also a lot of cooks who are maybe not even invited to the kitchens. And so when I think about that, I work primarily with provincial and community. And so when we talk about funding and we talk about power, and I'm not saying that, there isn't power imbalances within those systems, but, most of sport is played at community and provincial levels. And so those voices and those cooks, to continue on that analogy, need to be included, and their meals brought to the table. So we need to recognize, I think, that sport, physical activity, recreation is across the board. And so we need to, when we think about visions and the future, we need to be mindful of that as well.
Not separate it as these layers, because really high performance isn't more important than, right? Yeah. We value things.
It's important, and it's important. And I think we talked about that, and I hope that comes through in this, that we recognize, I think, as a group, that is absolutely, and for all the reasons we've talked about, but there is a lot of sport played at a lot of different levels, and for all the reasons that we want to see in our country.
And we as a group are working on kind of mapping the system, and making it visual, I think, is really powerful. I saw it in our local club, where making it visible, you know, the masters, the juniors, the universities, and all the roles they play, how much they contribute, how much they volunteer, like making it visible made everybody just go, oh, okay. Because it's equitable. It was amazingly balanced, really. Yeah.
And to the point about high performance sport, and again, like, we are all involved in high performance sport, but when we look at sport in Canada, what percentage is high performance? It's a very small percentage. And in order to have the high performance, we need such good participation. We need numbers, right? And we have the numbers. But when we're not focusing on that participation, we're not going to get that high performance. So sometimes I feel like people in high performance focus too much on the high performance, forgetting the basics. And from like wearing a coach's hat, if I'm coaching some really difficult technical skill, but I haven't gone back to my basics and retaught those basics over and over again, that higher level skill isn't going to be the best it's going to be, because I haven't gone back to the basics. So I think we do often need to go back to the basics of participation in community sport in order to build our high performance sport.
Yeah, I think two things that I was thinking of, and they kind of go along with what Danielle was just sharing, and probably a little bit of Elena as well. But for me, power, especially in the Canadian sports system, what we reward is what gets reinforced. And at the moment, like, what we are rewarding is performance. And I think that is part of the problem, like part of like the core issue. And I would love to see us prioritize participation, because then our pool gets bigger, then our athletes are more competitive, and then we have more athletes to choose from. And so I think in refocusing a little bit more on that, like 99% potentially, like if we think of like high performance as maybe the 1%, what if we were to empower the 99? What if we were to give more access to sport? Certain communities don't even have access to sport. So I wonder about like that piece in terms of like, really, like, if we lift the lens all the way to the top, I would love to see us try to reward something different. I think it would be risky, and we would have to have courage to do that, because we don't know what that would do. But if you think of it logically, just having more athletes in sport, more athletes participating, our pools would just get larger. And hopefully that would mean we could be more competitive. And so those were like those 2 points, kind of connecting like community sport and like the money and power. I think just I had a thought about the cooks in the kitchen, and thought, what if we didn't have any cooks in the kitchen? What if we mixed it up and we actually just gave the food directly to the hungry athletes? Like, I don't know, like, I just had a moment of thinking, like, why do we have to play the game with these chefs if they're not working together? Like, can't we just bypass them altogether? And I know that's radical and probably not the best solution, but I just think, like, I mean, if this is, there's like, to Jen's point earlier of a burning platform for change to get folks to jump off, like, this isn't it. Like, I don't really know what is, so is there a way to change that reward system in our sport where we can empower others and more people to even participate? Is kind of like where my head was going with it.
Reward what we value. So what do we value? Numbers? Do we value participation? Clearly, we just sort of value a lot of medals right now, but which is creating a real division and making people kind of resentful. And there's not so much about that, oh, we're so in love with our national team athletes. I'm seeing that sort of wane gradually, almost a resentment building in the clubs, and danger, danger, danger. We're going to lose the whole thing's the house of cards going to fall down. So yes. And so Canadian sport policy needs to be that more visual, holistic integration of, alignment of all the different silos. Silos are great. They store things, but without a train system connecting them all and distribution process of sharing knowledge and learning. Love the idea of just set up a buffet instead of having a bunch of hoity-toity chefs. Not that they're hoity-toity, but that idea, that model of leadership, right, could really shift as well. Okay, wow, we've talked about a lot, and it's our hour and a half is coming to a close, but and let me know if you need to go off. But I just want to finish off with bringing people to, Katrina brought something up earlier, just before we started in our little chat about a story, Rick Westhead, who's become so famous as a journalist. Got to give a real shout out to the journalists doing the work around sport right now too. I mean, it really is where the discourse, a lot of the pressure is coming from. I love it. It's giving people a voice too, I think, that wouldn't normally feel they have one. So it's been valuable. But a story that he's just covered. Do you want to just tell the people about that?
Sure. Sure. It was about researchers in Pakistan are developing, I could just read it, but researchers in Pakistan are developing AI that can detect violence in video footage technology that may be used to deploy police sooner when violent acts are captured on CCTV. The researchers said that they used 1,000 videos of NHL game footage, 500 of which fights helped teach and develop the software.
How to recognize violence. So unequivocally, it is violent. And we have some good empirical evidence of that. And but we also have provided so many great ideas, concepts, insights for the sport leaders in our country to consider, to make sure we're sustaining a number of truths, a number of values, not forget about some for the sake of others, and avenues to creating those ways to leverage artifacts that exist already, leverage what already exists in Canada, make sure that it's an integrated policy around sport in Canada so that we don't lose sight of all the things we do value. Think about what we're rewarding a little more completely and trace that all the way through the system. Last words, any other comments you want to make about our discussion?
I think just to that last point of discussion around power imbalance, I think I truly believe it can be used as a competitive advantage. I think it can be interpreted as, well, we would lose the performance, but the disseminating that power allows for minority voices to be heard. It allows for representation, and none of us would be here if athletes weren't athletes, right? We have to remember that they're the reason we're even having this discussion. So I think it really can, if we change the narrative around, how we're structuring these systems and the power and what we're rewarding, I think it can be an and versus a but. I don't think we have to lose something, but I think it's an integration of a more holistic approach to our sports system that's possible.
I think it's beautifully said. Thank you, Jordan. Great way to finish off. It's and, not a but. Thank you. Not losing anything. So appreciate the time. We'll, of course, be hearing more from all of you in various realms and contexts, I'm sure, but I'll have you back on, I'm sure, at some point. And really appreciate, this was an intense conversation. So glad we were able to capture it. I'll be sharing it out widely, of course, and we'll see you all next time.